therefore a decline in the price of the house immediately means that the loan outstanding against it is worth more than the house itself is worth. This triggers a second problem. The loan foreclosure problem will not merely be a problem of those people who took out loans that they could never afford to service in the first place. It's now a problem that's going to affect people who can service their loans, but who stand back and say, why should I do that? I have a loan for $300,000 because I bought a $300,000 house, and now the price has gone down and it's only worth $240,000. Why should I continue to service $300,000 of debt on a house that's only worth $240,000? Now, to be sure, lots of people would like to remain in their current homes, and most will continue to do so. But I think it's naive to suppose that the foreclosure problem will be limited to people who default on their loans only because they can't pay it back. And then finally, there's the neighborhood effect. If you live on a block in which 3 other houses have foreclosures, your property value is going to fall sharply regardless of whether you're keeping current on your mortgage and regardless of how effectively you're maintaining your property. So every foreclosure that takes place triggers a further decline in housing prices in the immediate vicinity in which it would take place. As a result of these 3 factors interacting among one another, the 3 being people who can't afford it, people who could afford it but see it's not in their interest to keep paying, and the neighborhood effect, the foreclosure problem is a very, very major issue. It's to the President's credit that he's come up with a program. I think we should all support the program, and we should immediately ask next week, where is the rest of it? $75 billion is a nice start, but is simply in no way adequate to the needs at hand. And now finally we come to what may be the hardest issue of all, what to do about the broken banks. What to do about the fact that, to pick a favorite one, Citibank. Citibank is insolvent. Citibank has fewer assets than it would take to repay the depositors and other credit. The bank has negative net worth. The bank has negative capital. What should we do? Not about the banks in general, because to be sure, there are plenty of banks in the country that were well run and as a result are in good shape today. But what about the Citibanks of the country? What can we do there? One approach that has apparently been adopted by the administration, although we really don't know yet, is to take the so-called bad assets over from the banks, remove them from the bank's balance sheet through some kind of public-private partnership entity that would buy them. It's very easy to see why this is not a good idea. The question, as usual, is one of price. If this public-private partnership is to take over these assets that are non-paying from the bank's balance sheet, what is that partnership supposed to pay? If it merely pays what the assets are worth, substituting cash for these securities, this does nothing to affect the fact that the bank is insolvent. The problem is that the assets in total that the bank owns are worth less than what the bank owes to its depositors and other creditors. So removing from the bank's balance sheet an asset that's, say, trading at 35 cents on the dollar and actually paying them 35 cents on the dollar does nothing to improve the net worth position of the bank. The bank is still insolvent and therefore still unable to lend. Now one might say, but that's not the idea. The idea is to pretend that this asset, instead of being worth 35 cents on the dollar, is really worth 65 cents on the dollar. So the public-private partnership will pay 65 for an asset that's really worth only 35, at which point the bank can take the extra 30 and credit that as profits and put that into its capital account. Well, this would, of course, redress the bank's insolvency problem if done in great enough volume, but the question then is, why should the public simply make a gift to the banks disguised as a purchase of assets? Why pretend that the money is being used simply to buy assets rather than, for example, take stock in the bank? Why not have the bank issue new shares for the $30 billion and have the Treasury buy the shares? Or have the public-private partnership, whatever that is, buy the shares? A more honest and straightforward way to do it that doesn't simply make a gift from the public purse to the books of the bank would be to do it through some sort of a share purchase. So my suggestion would be that to the extent that banks can be made solvent by the infusion of new capital, the government, together with whatever private entities are willing to participate, would do much better to purchase new shares rather than to conceal the contribution of capital to the banks as a purchase of assets for more than they're worth. This finally leads to the question of what to do about the banks that are so deeply in that any plausible purchase of new shares simply is not going to solve the problem. Alas, I think there's only one answer, and that is to nationalize them. The banks, most of the large banks in the United States, are regulated by the controller of the currency, and the controller of the currency legally has the right to declare a bank insolvent and to ask the FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which is obligated to make good on the deposits, to step in. And I would begin tomorrow morning, and I would begin with Citibank. Citibank seems to me the most obvious case, A, because it's the largest bank, B, because it's the one that was the most flagrantly mismanaged, and C, because it's the one that is most in the insolvency range today. A year and a half ago, the equity in Citibank was valued at more than $250 billion. Today, the equity in Citibank is valued at about $14 billion. And literally all of that 14 is simply a gamble that the government will provide a bailout in the form of artificially paying a higher price than what the assets are worth. So if I were doing this, I would redress the banking problem by separating the banks into three categories: the ones that were well managed and that can be left to their own devices to keep going just as they were. Second, the ones that are insolvent but not so badly so that they need to be nationalized, and there the right solution, I think, is not concealed gifts in the form of phony asset sales and purchases, but rather an outright purchase of shares. And then finally, for the third category, what I'll call the Citibanks of the country, the answer is simply nationalize it and do it tomorrow morning. Thank you very much.